Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Call of Juarez Bound in Blood for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a first-person shooter and the second game in the Call of Juarez series, although it is a prequel to Call of Juarez. It was developed by Techland and published by Ubisoft in June of 2009, and it's a pretty weird experience going from actually this to the original Call of Juarez, because they're wildly different games in game feel. The engine just functions wildly different. The gunplay is wildly different. All of it. It feels like they just did a ground-up rewrite and kept some of the ideas from the original Call of Juarez and went with different trends for a lot of other things. The question is, does this wild change of feel actually make the game better or worse than its predecessor? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's a very noticeable step up from the original game. And you'd expect that, considering a couple of years went between these two releases. But the visuals, despite being better from a quality standpoint, with much improved modeling, that's actually very detailed for the most part, very smooth animations that actually look really nice, and much better texture work with a lot of detail in the environments and everything as well. Despite all these improvements, they failed in one particular aspect that's admittedly a bit subjective, because not everyone is going to be affected by FOV problems, as well as the headache-inducing nature of the bloom lighting and the blurring effects. It's less severe for certain people, but I actually get pretty massive headaches if I play this game for longer than about 30 minutes to an hour. So it's something that you have to keep in mind. If you are affected by low FOV or blurring effects or bloom lighting, because this game has a lot of blurring effects and a lot of bloom lighting, it will induce headaches, and that makes the appreciation of the graphics much harder. It also doesn't help that almost everything in this game looks like a various shade of tan or brown. The colors are very washed out, and in fact, when you're running around with the various firearms in the game, when you get the upgraded versions of various weapons, they turn either silver or gold, and the gold actually looks like a tan color rather than a gold color. It just looks odd. That washed out nature of the colors just does not help this thing at all, and it really doesn't help when you're getting headaches when you're actually playing the game. That said, the sound design is pretty well done for the most part. The voice acting is rather hokey and cheesy, but there's a problem with that. Whereas in the original game, it was a pretty ridiculous game, and at times was aware of it, and you could actually kind of get into the voice acting because it was just cheesy, and the whole game was cheesy, so it fit in pretty well. In this one, they try to play it straight, as in, they actually tried to make their story a bit more emotional and thought-provoking to some degree. Not really thought-provoking, but just more so than the original Call of Juarez, to the point where the game was actually kind of serious, and they just failed miserably at it. Because the voice acting is so incredibly corny a lot of the time that you just can't really take it all that seriously. And in fact, it ends up being almost like a soap opera rather than anything that's legitimately dramatic. Then you have the music, which is pretty suitable for a Western. It works pretty well, and some of the tracks are very nice, but it just kind of fades into the background. You don't really notice it as much when you're in the midst of combat and everything, which is where they actually made some pretty significant improvements. The weapon sounds and such in the original Call of Juarez just sounded a bit odd. They sounded a bit stock in a lot of spots. In this one, less so. They seem more punchy. They sound more like guns do, as opposed to the more movie-style gun sounds that you'll hear in the original game. And it's a marked improvement because of how the weapons handle and everything in this particular game compared to the original, which I'll get to in a moment. But overall, the sound is up to the same quality standard as the original game, and in some ways slightly better, while the visuals are noticeably improved in quality, but much harder to appreciate. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story is that you play as the two McCall brothers, Ray and Thomas. You remember Ray from the original Call of Juarez, and in that particular game, he was the only good part of the whole game, really. Whenever you were playing as Ray, things were ridiculous and amusing. In this particular game, you can choose to play as either Ray or Thomas for most of the levels in the game, although there are certain ones that only allow you to play as one or the other. And their paths are actually kind of different, but the main plot stays the same. It starts out in medias res and goes to flashback of a couple of years prior to the current events when Ray and Thomas were fighting the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. And eventually they abandon their posts and run off to save their home and end up getting run out of there, eventually becoming outlaws, basically, and seeking the legendary treasure of Juarez. Along the way, they run into a lot of unscrupulous types and end up having a great deal of strife between them over a woman. So, in a lot of ways, it's a very typical Western story, or just a very typical story in general, with the two brothers fighting over a woman kind of thing. But it gets a bit more complicated than that with the whole Treasure of Juarez thing going on. And it leads up to the events that you'll find in the original Call of Juarez. Frankly, the story in this game is trying too hard to be dramatic. It's trying too hard to have an emotional impact, and it just fails miserably at it. It's hokey, it's corny, so you can't really get attached in this game. It's not that the characters are bad or anything, it's just that it's done in a way that means you can't really get attached to them. You just grow associated with them by actually playing the game as one character over the other. And they're very different play styles. Ray is slow. He's the older brother. He's slow. He's wearing that breastplate of his and just runs around dual-wielding revolvers and basically being a walking tank. But he can't move very fast, and he's not able to do much jumping or anything like that, which is Thomas's realm of expertise. He is the younger brother. He's also lighter. He moves a lot faster, which means, of course, he can do more jumping and use his lasso and things like that. And, of course, the two brothers help each other out through the course of the game, through the gameplay mechanics as well. You'll have moments where you need to do a team action, so to speak. And it's usually just one brother helping the other over an obstacle. As in, Thomas helping Ray over an obstacle because Ray can't climb or jump or anything like that. But they are very different play styles because Thomas is lighter and such. He is also more accurate. He's the more precision instrument kind of guy, whereas Ray just walks in and wrecks everything. And their equipment actually remains consistent throughout the entire game. If you pick up, say, a quality revolver, just as a random example here, as Ray, and you decide to play as Thomas for a while, when you come back to Ray, he'll still have that quality revolver. Which, in some ways, is nice, because unlike the original Call of Juarez, where your equipment changed every single level, now it's consistent. But that's the problem. If it's consistent, it means that you still keep the crappy stuff that you started with if you didn't play as one character or another for a while. So, you just have to keep that in mind as you play through the game, and you'll probably favor one brother over the other just based on your playstyle. I tended to prefer Thomas just because I prefer being the guy who's good with rifles, so to speak. Whereas other people would prefer to play as Ray in certain situations in particular, but for most of the game, just because he runs in and he dual wields and he's your typical Western gunslinger kind of character. Unfortunately, gone is the mechanic where Ray can whip out a Bible and just start quoting passages as he blows guys away. because at this point in the series, he's actually not a preacher yet, so unfortunately, it doesn't make sense for him to have a Bible and start preaching to people all of a sudden. But the gameplay is your pretty typical modern first-person shooter. It's extremely linear, to the point where pretty much everything is kind of a hallway, and there's a lot of enemies running at you at once. So you'll just have to fight your way through hordes of enemies, and eventually you'll get to the sort of boss of the area where you have to do a duel with them. And during the duel, you control your hand with the mouse, and you have to keep your hand close to your gun while also moving with the arrow keys. You have to keep the enemy in focus, because when you draw, it's slightly off-center. So you have to make sure you're capable of targeting them properly and have your hand close to your gun so it's quick. And as you progress through the game, it gets harder and harder and harder to do that. And you'll also find that the game is a bit twitchy with regards to doing that on the mouse. I don't know about on the gamepad, but on the mouse, it has a habit of not really working all that well, because you draw it with a mouse movement and then shoot. And you have to wait until the crosshair is actually on the target for the shot to actually hit, obviously. And of course, when you get further and further into the game, it gets harder and harder because the enemy draws a lot faster. So the duels end up being one of the weakest parts of the game, when they should be just this cool, intense, badass way of ending a level. But they're just frustrating more than anything else, particularly when you get late in the game. There's also segments of the game where it actually opens up and allows you to roam around for a while and do side missions and purchase equipment and such like that. It's an interesting way of doing things, but I wish they had done more with it. It only happens a few times, and the side stuff isn't really all that interesting. So unfortunately, what happens is that you just do a side mission or two because you want to get a better revolver or something, and you're like, okay, well, I need money, and this thing offers, say, $100 for me to go bounty hunting or something like that. Well, I better go off on this mission. And so you do that, and you come back, and you're like, okay, off to the story again. So it feels like a missed opportunity. They could have done a lot more with the free world stuff, where you can just run around in this fairly open environment and just do stuff. But most of the game is extremely linear, hallway kind of stuff, the stuff you're used to in modern FPSs, and it just falls flat. So you have most of the game, and then you have the duels at the end of almost every level, and then you have the few instances of roaming around in a fairly open world. And it doesn't feel very consistent. The gunplay does. It actually feels rather nice, especially compared to the original game. Your guns actually feel powerful now, and you can take out enemies with good targeted shots, and you get this concentration mode that's sort of like it was in the original game. But in this one, you can mark targets and then execute, which makes a bit more sense than just the slow-mo. But it makes the game a bit too easy sometimes, and so you'll probably want to use it sparingly. There are certain instances where you have to use it, so that can get annoying. And there's a fair amount of slow-mo stuff going on in the game. Not a huge amount, but enough to, if you don't like slow-mo breaching maneuvers and such like that, it can probably get on your nerves. But all in all, it's a pretty solid first-person shooter. It just feels inconsistent, it gives me headaches, and it feels consoleized. It feels like it's too modern for its own good. Like they tried to play it too safe. And if they had tried something very different, it probably would have worked better. As it stands, you move a bit too slow. Your movement just doesn't feel quite as smooth as it should be. You feel like sometimes the game is just limiting your choices. The level structure is just really linear for the most part, and that does wear on you after a while. But it's certainly an improvement over the original Call of Juarez. There's no denying that. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. It has a lot of problems, but it's not a bad game. I just can't really recommend it per se. If you're really craving a Western FPS, then I can sort of recommend it. Because as Western FPSs go, it's not too bad. It's one of the better ones, actually. Which, admittedly, isn't saying all that much, but that's beside the point. So, ultimately, I have to give Call of Juarez Bound in Blood a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.